Thanks everyone for joining. For those of you joining in the US, I know it's mid-morning, and those of you joining from Europe, it's getting towards the end of the day. I'm Jamie Fly. I'm senior fellow here in Berlin at the German Marshall Fund. Up until June, I was president of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, which excites me to have journalists today to talk about the American election that's coming up in a couple of months. When I was running Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, I could get the pulse of what was going on in more than 20 countries just by talking to our frontline journalists. They always had a better sense about what was going on, I think, than most analysts, and I think that's the case with American journalists as well. So I'm excited to have with me today John Rash, who's an editorial writer and columnist at the Minneapolis Star-Tribune, and he's written about a variety of domestic and international issues, and also puts out a podcast from the editorial board of the Star-Tribune. He's joined by Rickey Bevington, who's a senior anchor and correspondent from Georgia Public Broadcasting. She's won a number of awards for her work in Atlanta, hosting NPR's All Things Considered. And from a GMF perspective, we're very proud that she's also an alum of our Marshall Memorial Fellows program. So both of them are well positioned to talk about the race thus far, about what voters in their respective states are focused on at this point. Both of their states are interesting in their own way, and we'll get into that in a bit. They've got unique angles. Minnesota has been a place that the Trump campaign has still talked about possibly being able to win. Georgia Democrats, I think, in recent years have been talking about Georgia perhaps turning blue, or at least becoming more purple over time. And so there are interesting state dynamics in this race as well. I've asked both of them, though, to get us started with just some initial kind of high-level remarks about their perspective on what is driving the conversation in their states right now about the election, what issues are resonating with voters. And then I've got a number of questions for them, and we will open it up. You can submit questions through the chat function, and I will pose the questions to them as the conversation goes on over the course of the hour. So why don't I ask you, Rickey, to start and just tell us what's going on in Georgia right now. When you're out there covering political issues, what are the topics that voters are talking about? What's driving the conversation about 2020?
Thank you so much, Jamie. It's such a pleasure to be here. I want to start by thanking German Marshall Fund for all of the work you're doing, educating people all over the world about really important issues all over the world. So I think it speaks to the global reach of GMF that you're in Berlin, I'm in Atlanta, John is in Minnesota, and people are joining us from, I don't know the map, but a lot of people, dozens of people are joining us from all over the world. So here in the South, for the first time in a long time, our major newspaper yesterday published a quality poll. Not all polls are made equal, but this one's quality, that the race between Donald Trump and Joe Biden is too close to call. That was not the case in 2016. And this reflects, first of all, Georgia remains a very conservative state. However, it's 2020. Every 4 years, people have a new opportunity to reassess what's happening and what the leadership is. And I think it's important that this poll is very recent, and it shows really literally neck and neck, and the assessment is too close to call. I have a lot of things that I'm happy to drill down to this hour about what's happening in the Southeast in Georgia. Of course, the pandemic is impacting elections. In the last 2 years, Georgia has completely overhauled its voting system. We spent $100 million on new election voting machines. So we're not only trying to vote during a pandemic, but we actually have new technology. And that's actually part of the conversation, because poll workers have to be trained, et cetera. And even voters, I've been voting on the same equipment for whatever, 30 years now, 20 years now, and now suddenly I have to learn a new technology. So this is part of the conversation. The average age of a Georgia poll worker is 70. When something goes wrong with a machine, they may not be able to quickly troubleshoot and reboot digital savvy is part of the conversation with polling. And then finally, I'll just mention our Senate race. It's probably the most high profile. People elsewhere in the world may have seen some of the attack ads. Two very high profile Trump Republicans are duking it out in what we call a jungle primary, which is very rare. It's also rare for Georgia to be having two Senate races in the same year. And this is because one of our senior statesmen stepped down due to health issues. And so there's a lot to discuss about Georgia, but that's the view from the Southeast at this point, just an overview.
Thanks, and that's an important point to end on, which we'll get into more later, because obviously with the death of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, the control of the Senate is being hotly contested across the country right now, and with two races in Georgia, that's going to play an important role. John, why don't I bring you in? How do those issues compare to what you're seeing in Minnesota? What are on voters' minds? What are people talking about as we get down here to the final month of the race? Is it a similar dynamic? Are there similar topics being discussed in Minnesota?
Well, good morning, and thank you, Jamie, and thanks to the German Marshall Fund for hosting this event. And I concur with my colleague Rickey in terms of the tremendous work that you and your colleagues do around the world. So I think that as the world is watching this election and they're looking for specific states, Georgia, Minnesota, and others, in terms of the direction it's going, in many ways, as so much of this country is at this point, it is nationalized and a referendum on President Trump. But of course, as with any specific state or region, there are dynamics that drill down to what's happening on the ground in that state. So we can and will certainly speak at much more depth about this as the hour proceeds. But if we look at the pandemic, of course, this is not just a national, but a truly transnational issue, the very definition of one, but how the Democratic governor has responded relative to Republican governors in the Dakotas and Iowa, surrounding states, has become an issue and a divisive one, as so many are nowadays. And that particularly plays out as the entire state legislature is on the ballot this year. If we look at the presidential race, and one of the key issues being the racial reckoning that the country is going through, and President Trump's, the president's particular take on it in terms of his law and order theme. Of course, this is an ongoing, enduring debate, but this latest aspect of it tragically started in Minneapolis with the killing of George Floyd at the hands of police officers here in the city. And so the resulting unrest that took place in Minnesota, that included looting and lawlessness, has become a proxy on this from a national perspective, but certainly on a state one, and that's driving a lot of the dynamics here politically as well, and affecting the U.S. Senate race, which we don't have two like Georgia have. One is enough to keep up in terms of what's happening here, but we have an incumbent Democrat, Tina Smith, and she is facing a fierce challenge from a former Republican representative, Jason Lewis. He was a one-term congressman who was initially elected in 2016 Trump victory, lost his seat in a very close race in 2018, and he's trying to become a U.S. Senator and certainly has a shot at it at this point. And so all of these international and national issues have a specific state staging that is reflective in a very dynamic debate. And I'll conclude with this till we get to the next aspect of the conversation. Most of your participants today will remember that Minnesota has the most enduring streak of Democratic victories of any state in the nation. The last time it went Republican was 1972 in the Richard Nixon landslide. But that does not mean that it's an overwhelmingly blue state. And indeed, President Trump came quite close to defeating Secretary Clinton in 2016. A margin of about 1.4 percentage points separated the two. He particularly has targeted Minnesota as a state that he thinks he can flip. He may indeed be able to do that. The next 6 weeks, of course, will be crucial, but I would say in many cases the next 6 days, because ballots begin arriving in the mail and voting is already open in Minnesota. So many people who have indicated a preference to vote by mail have already received their ballots. So it's happening in the here and now. Thank you.
Great, thanks for those initial assessments of what's going on in your states. I mean, why don't we just get into some of the issues that you both raised? Maybe start off with the pandemic, and I'll turn to Rickey. What is the impact as far as you can tell? You mentioned the elderly ages of poll workers, for instance, which I've seen discussed in some media reports as a voter kind of access issue if you don't have enough people to staff the polls. But more broadly than that, kind of how is the pandemic affecting the conversation? Do you think incentivizing more citizens to actually participate in the election, or is it perhaps distracting them, just given everything else that they're dealing with, and maybe with limited lockdowns in some places? How is the pandemic influencing the conversation about the race?
Well, in terms of voter turnout, I think it's hard to say, if people are more or less likely. I haven't seen any polling, for example, on if people are more or less likely to vote because of the pandemic. If somebody has that, I'd be very curious. I think that the polling, and this is done by Pew, shows that consistently Trump voters are voting on 3 top issues: the economy, law and order crime, and immigration. And consistently, Biden voters are voting on healthcare, coronavirus, and racial inequality. And so you can't talk about, basically, Republicans and Democrats are going to the polls for entirely different reasons. So it's hard to make a general statement about the pandemic. I think the most important nuances that we're seeing is how much people trust whether their vote will be counted during a pandemic. And that's a difference between in-person voting and mail-in voting. And we're seeing that that Democrats are more likely to vote by mail-in, and they're more likely to trust that that's going to be counted. Conservative voters are more likely to say that they'd rather show up to the polls. I will tell you that more than 1.1 million Georgians have already requested a mail-in ballot. The state, in response to the pandemic, did create a website where you can just log in, say, hey, I'm a voter, I'm registered, please mail me my ballot, and I will mail it back to you. And also, there's some litigation right now, but currently, a judge's order has it such that if your mail-in ballot is postmarked by Election Day, it can be counted up to 3 days after Election Day, as long as it's postmarked accurately. And this is important because people aren't getting to the mailbox in time. Another fail-safe that some counties are implementing is drop boxes. So rather than trying to trust the mail, you can put it right into a secure drop box. The Secretary of State of Georgia, the State Elections Commission, and county elections officials are really being forced to get creative about making it easier to vote right now.
What about John? John mentioned that there was a domestic or a local angle to the COVID conversation, a debate about the way that local officials, including the governor, had responded. Rickey, is there anything similar to that playing out in Georgia, where the Georgian state government's response has created controversy and is somehow being tied to the broader conversation about the presidential election?
Sure. I mean, the new AJC, Atlanta Journal-Constitution poll, asked about the Governor Brian Kemp's response to coronavirus. That again falls along party lines. Our governor is extremely closely tied to President Trump. He has rarely strayed, except in the Senate race, which we're happy to talk to you. It's the one time he's really publicly broken with the president. And so again, like all things seem to be a referendum on Trump. Even our Trump-aligned governor's response to the pandemic seems to be, the reaction to that seems to fall along people's attitudes about the president, rather than necessarily the nuances about the decisions that the governor made. Our governor has broken with many other Southern governors and has refused to do a statewide mask mandate, whereas Alabama did that. And so even among Southern Republicans, there's been different decisions made in terms of local decisions versus statewide decisions.
John, if you could talk a little bit more about the way that COVID you think is affecting the political conversation, but then also pick up on some of the issues that Rickey highlighted about voter access, about the, it seems like be a nationwide discussion about mail-in balloting. How is that playing out in Minnesota right now?
Well, the two are tied, of course, and Minnesota, similar to Georgia and so many other states across the country, have a record number of absentee ballot requests, vote by mail requests, not even any close comparison to any other previous year, as has played out in other states, and certainly with President Trump and his strong resistance to voting by mail. The state Republican Party has consistently pushed back on this. The Democratic Secretary of State has moved forward on it. And so you again have a split basically on the method of voting. I know this was a scene that projected across the country, if not the world, but had particular resonance here in the Wisconsin state primary when they had so many voting troubles, extraordinarily long lines in cold weather, and it was reported that at least 7 voters contacted COVID through that process. That sent a chill across many in Minnesota and a real desire to have a vote by mail protocol to be able to move forward. In terms of how it's playing out politically, the Democratic governor, who is generally perceived as more moderate than some in his party, he ran on a platform of one Minnesota, trying to unite the state from its traditional metro base, often called the cities because of the Twin Cities, and then greater Minnesota. The divisions, conversely, seem to be deeper than they ever have been. And so he moved quite differently than surrounding states, including ultimately imposing a Minnesota mask mandate that has proved extraordinarily unpopular with some in the state, generally falling along political lines, although people have generally adhered to it. But again, we're in a region where the Dakotas, which has had a spiraling case count in the last weeks and have become one of the nation's epicenters, they have not had a mask mandate, as has been well covered. The governor of Iowa is in a fight with Des Moines, the biggest city, in terms of whether the schools meet on time. So there's controversy throughout the region, Wisconsin as well, certainly here in Minnesota. Again, it often falls along partisan and geographic lines in terms of how people respond in the metro area, the cities versus greater Minnesota. And finally, there's the other added unique angle in that Minnesota is quite proud of its healthcare legacy. It's generally one of the top 2 states in terms of the number of people with health insurance, and of course is home to the Mayo Clinic and University of Minnesota Medical Center, and has generally looked itself as a state as a leader, not a laggard in terms of healthcare. So some of this resistance belies that image and has become yet another unpredictable dynamic, in the election, but one clearly that I think, as opposed to dampening voter enthusiasm, has only increased it.
Could I just ask you, John, I'll ask the same with Rickey then. A lot of this issues related to mail-in balloting, voter access, it relates to misinformation being spread in the American political system. So I'm just curious, John, from your perch, has your editorial board weighed in on any of these issues to try to talk about the facts and provide the facts to your readers as they get ready for the election about what is or is not the right way to vote, and what are the types of voting that are maybe more risky than others? Has your newspaper got into those issues at all in its coverage?
Well, thanks for asking, and indeed we have, and we've looked at it from different perspectives. From an editorial board and institutional editorials, we have talked about it from both a democracy perspective, and we have consistently believed in maximizing voter participation. Minnesota usually is between number 1 and number 2, along with Utah, in terms of voter turnout in every election. And part of that is the good civic spirit that a lot of Minnesotans have, but part of that is legislative framework surrounding that, including same-day registration. You can go and vouch for someone at the polls, and we've generally really leaned into voting here. That's met with some resistance, and it especially is this year because everything is so nationalized, and because of the balkanization effect of social media and the disinformation that's been out there. So we have opined about it in terms of disinformation, in terms of democracy and how to vote about it, but most importantly, in terms of health protocols, in that the main reason why so many people have requested absentee ballots, and the main reason we're so behind it, is it's designed to keep people safer. We're in a lethal pandemic, and we as an editorial board believe that every measure within reason should be taken to keep people safe. That, of course, includes voters, but also poll workers, who Rickey so rightly pointed out are of a certain, if not indeed the greatest generation here. Part of that becomes a challenge in terms of, they're more vulnerable by most health statistics to COVID, and we certainly want to keep them safe as well. Finally and quickly, as a columnist, I often focus on the intersection of media and politics, and you can't get a story that engenders this more than the disinformation that surrounds this issue, and then certainly surrounds the campaign, including work that the German Marshall Fund and others have followed, the disinformation, aggression from Russia, China, Iran, and other hostile actors.
Rickey, how is Georgia Public Radio handling that same issue, which I'm assuming is also relevant in the Georgian discussion?
Absolutely. I mean, it's the job of journalists hasn't changed. We just stick to the facts. We did launch a podcast yesterday about everything you need to know about how your ballot will be counted, what's being done at the state level. I think we kicked it off with a long interview with the Secretary of State. So we are going on the offensive in terms of educating people, which is what journalists do. We're here to tell you what you need to know. But I will say for our European audience, Americans have always had a healthy skepticism about our governments. It's sort of part of the DNA, it's part of federalism. And so particularly in the Southeast, we have a history of voter disenfranchisement from generations. Nearly 10 years ago, the US Supreme Court invalidated portions of the 1965 Voting Rights Act, which meant that Southern states were free to make changes to local election laws without federal pre-approval. Effectively, states used to have to prove that nobody would be harmed by this law. So immediately we saw things like voter ID requirements, exact match, like your signature has to be perfectly perfect. I mean, my handwriting is terrible, so I can promise you my vote would not have been counted. And so I would say, by and large, there is a history of people's votes not being successfully, processed in the Southeast. However, typically, and so there's real legacy of voter disenfranchisement, legal and illegal, However, as always, we see parties using trust in voting to their political advantage, depending on what the political expediency is for that party at the moment. So that's always going to be in play, but that is something that certainly has a history, particularly in the Southeast.
And that, I think you're right, and that history, though, has been there for decades and centuries. But this all comes, obviously, at a moment when the race conversation in the United States has been brought into sharp relief, as John noted, by the killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis, and the protests that have resulted from that. And then I think you earlier, Rickey, mentioned President Trump's mantra about law and order, which is really his response to that. which I've just anecdotally, I think I've seen is successful for him on the right to a certain extent. So maybe I'll start off with Rickey on this. I mean, Georgia has been kind of at the center of some of those protests and the controversy of that conversation. How has that played out? And beyond the voter access issue and renewed concerns about that, how is that influencing the way that people are mobilizing in advance of the election?
Once again, reliable opinion. Well, first of all, let me give you some context about Georgia. Soon after the murder of George Floyd, Georgia has been the site of at least two very high-profile murders of African-American men just during the pandemic. So Atlanta has seen a lot of protesting, Atlanta and other small towns, some rioting and looting, and I had a machine gun, semi-automatic rifle drawn on me in the middle of a cloud of tear gas trying to cover what was happening. So Georgians have been living through this in a very real way. But I will say that reliable national polling shows that between 2016 and 2020, more Americans, more voters the way that the question is framed is, do you believe it's more difficult to be Black in the United States? That's one way that pollsters sort of frame this question. And the way you ask questions matters, right? In terms of trying to grasp people's. So 44% of Americans responded yes in 2020. In 2016, 35% of Americans. So we're seeing a growing awareness of an awakening in the United States, however. The change is coming largely from white Democrats, this is according to reliable polling, among Republicans. So that 35 to 44% is actually happening more within one voting block, so to speak, which I think is important. Again, back to everything being a referendum on Trump. If you're with Trump, that's not an issue for you. You're not going to the polls motivated by that, except potentially you see violence and rioting in Atlanta and you say, I don't want that in my small town. Absolutely not. Does that answer your question, Jamie?
Yeah, it does. And to pick up on that, John, I'm curious if the debate's playing out in similar ways in Minnesota. I've actually seen on the right, people use Minneapolis as an example of maybe to scare conservatives into supporting Trump because of some of the defund the police conversation that happened in the wake of George Floyd's killing. Talk us through what that discussion is like right now in Minneapolis and in Minnesota more broadly around race, and if you think it has a similar dynamic to what Rickey described in Georgia.
Indeed, it's extraordinary to see your city become a code word. And if people would have invoked Minneapolis or Minnesota, the locals would look back to the mid-70s Time magazine cover with the governor holding up a walleye he had caught on a lake, and it said, the good life in Minnesota. And that's the way that we projected ourselves, at least in our own image. And in many ways, Minneapolis was looked at as a city in a metro area that worked. And right now, it's looked at as one that is among the epicenters of chaos in this country, along with Portland and some others. And I think that there certainly are some core Democratic voters here who the number one issue for them is racial inequality, these enduring issues that we finally have to tackle and have to move forward on. And that's a significant motivator among many who already were supporters of Vice President Biden and other Democrats down ballot. Conversely, what seems to have faded among many in the state, and this intensifies the further you get away from the core metro area, is sadly the killing of Mr. Floyd and much more the aftermath. We had multiple days here of true lawlessness, including a lot of looting, fires, and a very literal and symbolic burning of the 3rd precinct in Minneapolis that was abandoned by the Democratic mayor and the police chief in the city. And that has become a rallying cry for many who look at this is the way that Democrats will run a state. We, as Rickey mentioned, people don't want that in their towns. An interesting dynamic has emerged, though, in that, as you mentioned, Jamie, this was also kind of one of the beginning areas of the defund the police movement. And you have a majority in the city council who said that they would vote to indeed do that, due to some arcane ballot reasons that can't go on the November ballot for this year. And meanwhile, there's been a demonstrable, quantifiable spiral in violent crime in the city. And among the biggest people pushing back, not surprisingly, are inner city residents, including many traditionally African-American neighborhoods, and who have pushed back on this and have demanded of the same city council, that they do something about the lawlessness in the streets. Before George Floyd's killing, the big debate in Minneapolis was the chief had asked for hundreds of more police officers, a position our editorial board endorsed because relative to other cities on a per capita basis, we were under-policed by a pretty significant margin. Well, then they went to the other discussion, and now that's mired in this pushback. All of this is playing across the state in a really remarkable way, has rallied Republicans, and is one of the reasons why this is a much more competitive state than people would assume it to be. Yes, there are pockets of very traditional Minnesota liberalism. This also is a significantly more diverse state than the one I grew up in, and then the one people may have associated with, Mary Tyler Moore or other depictions of Minnesota in popular culture. We have more people of Somali descent living in Minneapolis than anywhere in the world except Mogadishu. And finally, I would add, one of the people representative of that community is indeed the congressional representative for the 5th district here in Minneapolis, Ilhan Omar. And this is not an abstract issue to many Minnesotans, nor to the President of the United States. Just last night, he again invoked her name in a very nativist, and I and many others would argue racist way, to the delight of the crowd that he was speaking to. It's become a national rallying cry. And so that resonates throughout the state as well. While certainly she has her supporters, many detractors, particularly, in the greater Minnesota portion. So that's another local dynamic that projects itself nationally as well.
I just want to remind the participants that you can submit questions through the Q&A feature. And actually, John, while you were speaking, someone just picked up on the discussion about the burning of the police precinct station. And if you could briefly, they asked about the indictment of 4 people who were charged with that attack on the police precinct station. And the questioner said they thought they were all white. And that's the interesting dynamic about a lot of the protests and the violence, that the perpetrators have often been Caucasians or others, or sometimes people just kind of trying to associate themselves with the protest and taking the protest in a violent direction. But John, do you know anything about that specific instance and whether that has provoked more conversation after that particular attack on the police station?
Great question. In the immediate aftermath, the governor came out, as well as several top officials, city and state, and said that there were indications that a lot of the looting and the fires that had been started, including the sacking of the 3rd precinct, and I can't overemphasize the shock to Minnesotans that this was, in that you saw a police precinct being stormed and being burned. And these are images that we see, in places of conflict around the world, not, in Minneapolis, Minnesota here. They indicated that a lot of the people, from what they were able to tell, were indeed white, many of them from out of state, many who allegedly wanted to instigate racial violence or instigate this incendiary situation. That hasn't played out in terms of the total number of arrests, and hasn't been as robust as they initially positioned it. They have arrested and charged some people associated with these riots. To my knowledge, I don't know if they've been able to specifically identify people who they would say are responsible for the 3rd precinct, because dozens of buildings were burned. This was extraordinary. I mean, you saw plumes of smoke over the city. You had, places boarded up into and through many of the suburbs. They had curfews, as many of our viewers may remember. They had to call out the National Guard, and then the full and biggest deployment of the National Guard in the history of the state. And they couldn't get control of it the first night. It took them 2 nights to get control. So, these were not minor skirmishes between law enforcement and protesters. This was a convulsion of a city. And so, yes, they have charged some people. I don't know if they've specifically identified that these people are responsible for the 3rd precinct.
If I may jump in, Jamie.
Yeah, go ahead, Rickey.
I think I would encourage people not to jump to conclusions about the race of somebody setting a building on fire and the Black Lives Matter movement or the Democratic Party. Or these events are so chaotic. I have never been more scared as a journalist than being at one of these protests. It's not about logic, it's not about strategy, it's not about politics, it's pure chaos. So what happens at these demonstrations, I should say not at the demonstrations, which are typically very well organized, peaceful, political statements, it's what happens later when the sun goes down. It's very, very scary, and it's in nobody's control. So we can't draw huge generalizations, I don't think, in my experience. Because mob violence is pure chaos, and that's it, full stop. It doesn't mean anything more to me, having been in the middle of it, than pure chaos. I will say, as a journalist, ever since Charlottesville, every time I have had to cover or send a producer to cover something like a social justice protest, there have been agitators who show up. Typically, they look like Antifa. Often they're white, and often they attack journalists as well. This is something journalists are now trained for, to protect ourselves against, not people who are there to make a political statement and hold signs, but people who show up later after the sun goes down to do harm because they're angry, and there's no, I can't speak for them. It's very, very, very complicated. And so making generalizations about the race of people who do violence, I feel like is reducing the complexity of these events.
I think it's an important point, and the challenge that this all presents, obviously, given the tense environment, the existing fissures are being exploited by actors who have their own agenda, and they, like you said, that probably has nothing, in some cases, nothing to do with a specific political party. People just want to cause chaos, and it also opens up American politics to exploitation from abroad. We have one question that was submitted about foreign interference, and I was just curious if you've seen much resonance amongst voters about the ongoing foreign interference, which the intelligence agencies continue to report on to the US Congress. by actors like Russia, China, Iran. Obviously, a lot of that plays out on social media, but we know historically from work that many colleagues at GMF have done, race is also an issue that these foreign actors, especially the Russians, have exploited in American politics for decades. So I'm just curious, Rickey, have you seen, as you cover events in Georgia, much public reaction? Because obviously there's also a very politicized debate about foreign interference in Washington, especially from the president, who's very reluctant to talk about this issue.
Sure. I haven't seen, you know, there may be anecdotes about people putting stuff on social media about the Russians. I would say in terms of foreign interference, this is, I'm saying this sort of half joking, but the word socialism is the foreign interference that people may be the most worried about. I'm making a little bit of a joke there, of course. The word socialist, of course, is coming up time and time again among our conservative Republican candidates, particularly in the Senate race, which of course has echoes from a long time of American history: fear of communism, fear of socialism from abroad. So I would say that that's, whether people realize it or not, to me, that's the code word for foreign interference, or at least non-American themes running through this election.
I have a couple foreign policy questions that came in, but actually before we get to that, I did want to, we briefly touched on the death of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, but maybe John, I'll ask you, how has that been covered in Minnesota over the last week, and the positioning now underway in the Senate between Democrats and Republicans about filling her seat? What's your sense about local perceptions of the Supreme Court issue, and whether it's really going to change anything? I mean, there's one line of argument that it, you know, will turn more people out to the polls on either side because they'll see in graphic detail the stakes. But what's your sense of that issue that's just actually been playing out over the last week?
Well, I think many Minnesotans join me and so many others in first just expressing sorrow over her death and admiration over her remarkable life. And that seems to be a few issues that can transcend the deep divides in our state and our society. But immediately and unsurprisingly, it pivoted towards politics and what was going to happen with her seat on the bench. It has played out predictably in the respect that Senator Smith, the Democratic incumbent, is of course against any immediate consideration of a replacement. Jason Lewis, her Republican opponent, is all in on immediately moving toward a replacement. And I think that, interestingly, he has mentioned, including in our editorial endorsement interview just yesterday, the specter of an election that may have to go to the Supreme Court and a potential constitutional crisis because we have 8 justices in case it became a 4-4 split. So I think that one of the aspects of this is already there seems to be a congressional cohort who are thinking that we're going to litigate this because it's going to be really close, and it may, as it did in 2000, as we all remember, wrenchingly, may go well beyond Election Day and all the way to the Supreme Court. So I concur with your assessment as well. I think that this is more of a reinforcing as opposed to a reassessment mechanism. I think that the core supporters of the 2 key candidacies are unlikely to pivot on this issue. They may be more motivated to go to the polls. I see in this state and a little bit more nationally what initially looked like was going to project against a tableau of a pro-life, pro-choice, reproductive rights dynamic has shifted somewhat at the urging of Democrats to look at it in the context of healthcare and the Affordable Care Act, known as Obamacare, of course, in terms of that might be the more immediate decision made by the Supreme Court. A new justice might be able to overcome the reluctance of Chief Justice Roberts as just one of the justices who they don't know if they can depend on, but that this might upend the Affordable Care Act, which of course goes all the way back to the beginning of 2020 and our discussion of the pandemic itself and the specter of even more Americans being uninsured, which at any time is an extraordinarily challenging situation, but particularly amidst the global pandemic is a absolute crisis intensified. So that seems to be a little bit more of a push among the Democrats. But again, this is how the national election is being projected locally as well.
Rickey, you mentioned the two Senate seats that are being contested right now. Has the Supreme Court vacancy, I'm sure it's become an issue in those races, but do you really see it changing much about the dynamics that were already underway in those races?
We'll see. We haven't seen any concrete evidence. It just happened on Friday that it was announced. I think we will be watching that very closely. Historically, both Republicans and Democratic voters say that in addition to those top three for each party that I mentioned in terms of why people vote, the Supreme Court is very important to both types of voters in the United States. Actually, surprisingly, it's like the one thing they agree on, okay? So I will pick up on John's point that, the conservatives in America have a 40-year head start on framing the Supreme Court as a pro-life debate. So the Democrats now, since Friday, are suddenly turning it into a referendum on the ACA. They're, good luck to the Democrats to try to get voters motivated to go to the polls based on defending the ACA. Messaging is important, but here in Georgia, I will read to you. I'm actually not going to read it to you, but the conservative candidates for Senate have been extremely explicit that this is a vote, that the Ruth Bader Ginsburg replacement is about one thing, and it's about abortion.
We've got a lot of questions that people have submitted about foreign policy. And my experience in American politics is that foreign policy is rarely an issue in presidential elections. There have been a few in my lifetime, foreign policy elections. But I'm interested to hear from both of you whether you think this one might be a little bit different, given that we do have a global pandemic. The president has tried to tie its origins in China to a broader China debate. How is foreign policy playing, if at all, in your states when it relates to the election? And do you hear voters when you're out reporting on the election, are they discussing foreign policy as they decide how to vote?
Nope.
John, any different things that you're hearing in Minnesota?
I think like so much it is a referendum on President Trump, but not as specifically on policies, more in personality. And those who are his supporters like his persona of, as they perceive it, being strong and, not playing along the rules of international institutions and global governance and the elite as they perceive it. Although I think many of them would have a hard time pointing to a specific policy except getting tough on China in a ephemeral, manner, but nothing in terms of real hard policies. Conversely, those who are supporting Vice President Biden, it again is a referendum on the president regarding foreign policy and more our lack of or loss of standing in the world, how internationally isolated some of them perceive us to be. But it's nothing like 2004, where the presidential election was also a proxy of a debate on the war on terror, broadly writ as they said it, and more specifically, the war in Iraq. And finally, what I would add is it's extraordinary to me that we are in our longest war, our 19th year in Afghanistan, and we still certainly have troops in harm's way across the world, but the amount of debate about Afghanistan in particular, but even the remembrance or the reckoning of what happened to Iraq seems to have completely faded, as has actually the architect of it, President George W. Bush, in terms of being someone Republicans, look to as someone that they would admire or hearken back to the past. It is very much a Trump Republican Party right now, and very much his America First foreign policy that his supporters seem to be rallying around.
One of the participants pushed back a little bit in the comments and was asking, well, doesn't China play into the economic conversation? Do you see that message resonating at all? Do either of you pick that up when you're talking to voters?
What was the question exactly? What do you mean by play? Meaning the impact of the trade war on America?
Yeah, China in particular, it's not just a foreign policy issue. It's not just an issue of alliances. China has an impact on many Americans' day-to-day lives, and there have been long-term frustrations, I think, amongst the American populace about Chinese economic policy and the way that it impacted jobs in certain industries in the US. And I think President Trump is trying to play that up, certainly, in his rhetoric, from what I've seen.
In Georgia, I haven't seen that people's day-to-day lives are truly in any way deeply changed. But again, back to, like, for example, Georgia is a big exporter of pecans, right? China is our biggest buyer. The Chinese love pecans. I wouldn't say that the fact that pecan farmers are desperate right now due to the trade war is actually impacting the broader populace. So we have these pockets of the economy, and particularly agriculture and trade, that are like, ouch, this hurts, this tough on China stance really, really hurts us, but we're not seeing that. When I wake up in the morning, my life isn't greatly changed. Again, back to John's point, right now, it's about the personality and the stance that Trump is tough on China, that I think is really actually changing people's minds.
We've covered a lot of territory and discussed a lot of the negative things going on in the US right now. I wanted to end on a positive note in our last 5 minutes. I mean, you're both out there as journalists in states which are not necessarily, I guess Georgia more so than Minnesota might fall into the red-blue category, but as I noted at the top, there's a lot of conversation about Georgia changing. So you're in states where it's actually fairly close. I went back and looked at the election results from 2016, and in Georgia, it was Trump by just under 5 percentage points. In Minnesota, it was Clinton by actually only 2.5, I think. So these are states where clearly there are a lot of Republicans and Democrats. And I'm just curious, there's this perception coming from the East Coast, where I used to live in Washington, about the red state, blue state divide. I mean, are Republicans and Democrats, despite the frenzy of this debate, are people still able to get along? I mean, people live next to each other. They have family members of a different party. How does that play out at the personal level that you're seeing in Minnesota and Georgia? And is there perhaps a positive message that we can end on about the state of politics in America that's not necessarily pitting everyone against each other, where people are able to overcome their differences and still agree? So maybe, John, I'll give you the first chance.
Well, I'm a Minnesotan, so I spend a lot of time in hockey rinks. And I played, and my daughter plays hockey, actually. My son's a swimmer, but you spend a lot of time in hockey rinks, and you come across people from all walks of life, and you're literally across the state, because it is the state of hockey is what they call it. And it's remarkable how people, while they have their political opinions, they function remarkably well in terms of getting along, talking about commonalities, occasionally talking about politics. But despite the deep divisions on election day, on most days, most people still have civil discourse, still work well together. I think that these differences are manifesting themselves at the state legislature, certainly on Capitol Hill and in some of our institutions. But thankfully, unlike some societies that are so shaken, it hasn't meant a complete civil breakdown. There are episodes that make news or are noted, but the vast majority of people still get along and still get along quite well. And let's certainly hope that that continues on November 4th as well.
Thanks, Rickey. Do you have any final thoughts on that topic?
I wish I had as much Minnesota nice as John conversation. Georgians, we're Southern. We have Southern hospitality to our advantage. We are so polite to one another in public and to each other's faces. Behind each other's backs, it's a different story. I will say, you know, at the end of the day, the most divisive thing has been our mask mandate. It's actually not been the presidential election. It's whether or not you wear a mask in public, which may or may not reflect the national divisions politically. But I think the numbers that you just described, Jamie, at the end of the day, America is half and half. Right, left, right? Like, we don't actually disagree on that much. I mean, we're talking about percentage points of difference. In fact, I think that the summary of the 2016 election is the number of people who swayed that election could fit inside a football stadium. That's how divided America is, meaning we overlap on a lot of fronts. I will just say that with this pandemic, everybody's trying to help each other survive. We're helping our neighbors, we're helping our colleagues, we're reaching out saying, what can I do to support you emotionally while you're stuck at home trying to homeschool kids and raise a puppy? And I think that I would like to say that Georgians are really just focusing on surviving together through a pandemic, regardless of the presidential election.
I think that's an important note to end on. Thanks to John Rash from the Minneapolis Star-Tribune and Rickey Bevington from Georgia Public Broadcasting. I didn't get a chance to get into it, but I want to thank both of you. I wanted to talk a little bit about the role of local media in American society right now, but you're both and your institutions play an essential role as it relates to politics and just the health of broader American society. And that's an industry that's under a lot of pressure. So very pleased that both the Minneapolis Star-Tribune and Georgia Public Broadcasting are there on a daily basis providing that service to your readers and listeners. So thanks for taking the time, and thanks to all the participants for the great questions, and watch for additional events on the GMF website. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you.